Welcome to Into Africa. My name is Mvemba Dizolele. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is a podcast where we talk everything Africa: politics, economics, security, and culture. Welcome. Liberia was the first African republic to proclaim its independence and is Africa's first and oldest modern republic. Liberia holds a special place in the African psyche because, as the name of the country suggests, it's really liberty. And its capital city is named Monrovia, which is in memory of John Monroe, US president at the time of the creation of this republic in the 1800s. The republic was settled by former enslaved Africans who had come from the United States and were sent to settle that area. And it was also populated by people who were enslaved or stolen from their countries, but the British Navy had intercepted in the high seas and directed them to be settled in the place that we know today as Liberia. Of course, Liberia was home to many other ethnic groups that lived there. The republic was born under that arrangement and eventually was led by an elite class of primarily those who had come from the Americas. I think in Liberia, they call them the Congos. And we see that Liberia, when you talk about the names in Liberia, you see a lot of British names or American names, quote unquote. Liberia has come a long way from the days of strongmen to the coups of Sergeant Doe and the war that followed, and eventually settling on the democratic path with the election of the first African president, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, in 2005. She had served 2 terms and then was replaced through another election, through a democratic process, by George Weah, who was world-renowned as a soccer player. George Weah served 1 term and conceded defeat last month on November 17th when the Liberians went to the polls for the second round for a runoff. Joining me to discuss the importance of an African president, in this case George Weah, stepping down freely and willingly after he lost the elections, is Charles Lawrence, a political analyst in Liberia, to dissect what happened and why we should care. Charles, welcome to Into Africa.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure to join you on this conversation. It is certainly a really exciting time in Liberia based on what we are seeing in terms of the outcome of the most recent elections. But if I step back, the foundation for, I think, what we are seeing was laid by Her Excellency, former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who, as you mentioned, she served 2 terms as president of Liberia and respected the constitutional term limit. And when she did that, Liberia, at least this generation of Liberia, witnessed something that has not been seen in Liberia for 70 years, for a democratically elected president to hand over to another democratically elected president. So that happened in 2018. When President Sirleaf handed over to George Weah. That was very exciting. It did kind of confirm that Liberia continuing on a democratic trajectory and political stability was important for a country that you said have seen a lot of tumult in the past. Now, where we are now is this new consolidation where in the ended elections, it was really fiercely contested. In October 10 elections, there were 20 candidates that were on the ballot. Liberia Constitution do require that for a candidate to win outright, they should get more than 50% of the vote in the first round. None of the 20 candidates met that threshold, and that required that the 2 candidates who were on the top of that listing who go into a runoff. This runoff occurred in November 14. I must say that the Liberians' faith in the democratic process continued because they turned out both in the first round in October 10 and the runoff showed a lot of enthusiasm and relatively very high turnout of the population. So that's where we brought us to this particular situation. And there was a lot of anxiety and tension in the country at the time as the NEC was reading out its results. Many people across the country were listening to the radio, and the NEC read out provisional results. When they reached up to 99.9% of provisional results, it became very clear that Joseph Boakai had an unassailable lead. That is, the remaining votes could not have helped George Weah CDC to make it win. And it is on that night that the country woke up to the reality that President George Weah made a phone call to former Vice President Boakai and conceded defeat. This was a momentous moment for Liberia in the way that it diffused a lot of tension. It was legally defined, and I think, and it set the basis now for what we are now seeing as peaceful and orderly transition that is expected based on the constitutional requirement.
A lot of information there, Charles. Let's dissect that a little bit, one piece at a time. Liberia had gone through a fierce and bloody war over a decade or so. President Johnson Sirleaf came in, set the country on a certain path. How did that foundation that the former president set, lead us to this moment?
I think the foundation she did set in terms of the governance structure and the government, they were all there to be tested, and they faced the test during this time. So the government structures that are important for this is the National Elections Commission. They do have a very clear and strong mandate to oversee the elections. And of course, the legislature is in place to ensure that appropriate resources was given to the NEC on time. There are questions here about, the timeliness of some of the resources to the NEC. But yes, the independence of the NEC and the open space for pluralistic democracy remain in the place, that political parties can form and get registered. The independent media remain in place. The government institutions to safeguard the democracy, including civil society, remain vibrant. And I think those foundations, we can take it back to these different steps that were taken during the Ellen Johnson, and the fact that, of course, she respected the Constitution and stepped down when the constitutional limit was there. Also begin to set up, I think, to the population that this norm about presidential succession is possible.
And in the case of the former president, Johnson Sirleaf, she also stays in the country, right? She lives in Liberia. She's not gone outside. Is that correct?
No, she has not gone outside. She lives in Liberia. She is involved in the local life. She runs her foundation. She is still yet active in promoting things that are important for her, and we can talk about some of those later on.
Yeah, and what does that say to the rest of Liberia, that a former president lives in the country? This is not always a given across the continent. Many presidents feel threatened and then they leave. They may be taken to justice. In her case, she chose to stay.
Yes, well, it does shows that, I think Liberia is showing that, yes, former presidents, they can still have a role outside the presidency. Although we can say that President Sirleaf is not as active and has rightfully not have been involved in any active politics. But yes, as a private citizen, being present, I think somehow that it let people know that if you realize what has happened with few of Liberia's former presidents, then this is a new page. Her being residing in Liberia is a symbolic of this new page, that persons can leave power and they can live peacefully in the population.
In the case of Liberia, you also had Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You had a tribunal. I suppose those played a role to help create the environment that you just described.
Yes, so there we can say we have a mixed results in that area. We have the Truth and Reconciliation process, and more or less we can say that process is unfinished in some aspects of the recommendations that are still yet need to be addressed. And part of that, of course, is the aspects that deal with criminal accountability for war crimes. And these were recommendations that the TRC had made with certain individuals. So that is still yet an outstanding issue. And I would say that it will be a question that the previous administration had on their table, dealt with it the way they felt they had to, and it will remain a question for the incoming administration as well, in terms of what path they will take in terms of addressing wartime accountability.
The unfinished side of the Truth and Reconciliation's work, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, obviously have not impacted negatively the democratization of the country, which is a good thing. Is that correct to say it's not impacted negatively, so the country is still moving on democratic path?
It's difficult to engage, but I think it does have some kind of impact in the democratic process. Former warlords still have possibility to participate in the democratic processes. We have seen some of them elected in the legislature and exercising influence in the legislature. The most recent elections got another warlord from the southern part of the country elected into the legislature. I think what it does say, therefore, is that Liberia has not shedded completely from the war legacy, and it is still yet a question, because one of what the TRC had recommended was lustration. But that, of course, was scrapped by the Constitutional Court that felt that without due process, lustration should not be applied. What that meant was certain individuals should have not been allowed to compete for public office. But with financial resources and things like that as the main factor, of course, then we are seeing former warlords engage in the current democratic space. So in a way, it dampened this very overall positive trend that we are describing.
Was that is that the cost of peace? Is that the price that Liberians had to pay for peace, or one of the costs?
Some argue that Liberia have to make some kind of balance around the economic costs. But yeah, it's more about shedding from the past and setting up new norms based on accountability, and the two sometimes collide, and that's where it touches a little bit on the democratic principles and foundations.
Let's go back to the transition itself. So Joseph Boakai had been vice president to President Johnson Sirleaf, had served with her during her 2 terms. In 2017, he lost. George Weah was an up-and-coming politician, big name, known around the world. What was the strength that he brought at the time, and how that changed leading into the election in October?
The dynamics of the election in October is this October elections is incumbency versus the rest of the 20 that were in the race. And therefore, I mean, when we were following this, we knew that definitely it was a 2 or 3 horse race among contenders that had possibilities for winning. Definitely George Weah, CDC, Joseph Boakai, Unity Party, more or less Alice Cummings of the ANC, Alternative National Congress Party. But what I think when the first round results came, it became very clear that it was a two-horse race, because most votes went to the top 2 candidates. I think what I would say is it is in the second round of the elections, the different configurations that happen played to the advantage, in my view, to Joseph Boakai Unity Party. So some of the candidates that have come 4th, 5th on the list align their support to Joseph Boakai. And I think that could have, there's also other things at play in terms of the regional dynamics, or what you call the geopolitics of things in Liberia. George Weah had a big and heavy support in Liberia's southeastern region. He got in most of those counties more than 80% of the votes. Whereas Boakai, who hails from the north in Lofa, picked a vice presidential candidate from Mvemba in the northeast direction, and Mvemba had a very substantial vote category, and we could find this alliance in Mvemba was important in tipping the results in Boakai as well. What was I think surprising was Montserrat, which had the biggest number of the votes in Monrovia. You would think that one party would have had a significant advantage, but Montserrat seems to have been evenly split amongst the two. Unity Party Boakai did win Montserrat, but it was not for a significant margin that could have been the result for his lead. So that turned the situation back to Mvemba, where, of course, with Boakai's vice president hailing from Mvemba, he had correspondingly significant high percentage of the vote in those regions.
I understand you correctly. We, in this case, Liberians had a couple dynamics playing. regional? Is the regional dynamics due to population density that's tilted in favor of Boakai or something else? And then two, you also talk about coalition building. So after the first round on October 10th, a lot of the candidates threw their weight behind Boakai. Can you talk a little bit about those dynamics and what do they mean going forward?
And some of these dynamics are linked to your previous question about the legacy of the war situation. I can mention this, and you may find that said as well that Prince Johnson, who is from Mvemba County, former warlord as well, had supported George Weah's CDC in 2017 when he defeated Boakai. And Prince Johnson, therefore, seems to be, since the end of the war, in all the elections that have followed, where he has put his vote has been where the win has happened. So that's something really that is important to note. He seems to be very revered in Mvemba County and highly respected, and his voice have weight. And the side he does take tend to sway the vote in that area. But I can also say, you're right about the coalition building. You can see that I think there were some kind of also tendency amongst some segments of the population, especially the youth, wanting to see change as well. So that worked in the Unity Party Boakai's favor.
So Prince Johnson, this is a fascinating point you're raising, Charles. Prince Johnson is a former warlord who had since taken a seat or won a seat in Parliament. And you say he's become a sort of a kingmaker, that in 2017 he had supported Weah, and that had played to Weah's favor and helped him win. But you're saying this time he had shifted alliance and aligned, stood behind former Vice President Boakai, who's now the President-elect. What is driving that change? Or what drove that change at the time?
It's very hard to say. The Prince Johnson party had been in the coalition with the George Weah CDC, and it was towards the end of the tenure that we then begin to see some kind of rift within, and this satisfaction about certain things that Prince Johnson was voicing, that he wanted to see more jobs to his kinsmen from Mvemba, more resource and things like that. But one can also postulate that probably George Weah CDC could have then said, can we win Mvemba without Prince Johnson's support? And if Prince Johnson's support is a weight on our credential for moving towards what they would like to do, to see, then they made that calculation. And on hindsight now, you can say it was a miscalculation. In a way, I think the calculation was they could win Mvemba without Prince Johnson's support. And how would they do that? They provide support to counter forces in Mvemba that were not within the belly and the influence of Prince Johnson, and see that those counter forces could be sufficient enough to mobilize votes for the CDC. And you can say that the CDC succeeded to some extent compared to the vote numbers they got in previous elections from Mvemba. In 2023, in these elections, they have more than double what their vote number was, but it was not sufficient enough to tilt this influence towards the other side. So this is something about the legacy of the post-conflict situation that continues to play within the current democratic space, I would say.
It's fascinating to still know that a former warlord is playing this major role in a democratic process. It's also fascinating, and I think if you can address that a little bit, why is Mvemba so critical?
Mvemba has always been critical. It's the vote numbers, but also it's part of, I think, as we begin to study the voting patterns in Liberia, we would then see that certain patterns are emerging, but none of them are consistent. So that made it for example, the Southeast. Most of the counties in the Southeast had voted the CDC, and many are now trying to say, oh, the Southeast is a CDC stronghold. It means that maybe in future elections, others may not want to invest in an area that they feel automatically they won't get votes from. But that may not be the case, because the Southeast in previous elections, 2005, 2011, there are counties in the Southeast that voted the Unity Party. They didn't vote George Weah CDC. I think what played out in this particular elections is that given that it must be resources for Unity Party of their planning and calculations, their standard bearer did not visit any of the counties in the southeast for a campaign. That could play into...
You mean the president?
No, the president Weah did visit, but Joseph Boakai, who was the...
Joseph Boakai did
he didn't visit that region. So that could be some of the indicators on why there. But Mvemba is... I think what is clear, therefore, that we can say about Mvemba is they always go where Prince Johnson have gone for the most recent elections, 2005, 2011, 2017, and now 2023.
So the last 17 years.
But what we are saying is we are seeing a gradual ebb into that influence, at least from what we see in these last elections. If I'm not wrong, George Weah CDC got somewhere 20% plus votes when in previous elections they were getting less than 10% of those votes. But the influence is stayed there, and that will be something that will be continue to be interrogated in the democratic space. Yes.
So where does Prince Johnson derive his influence from? And why did he not line behind Weah this time?
Why he didn't align to Weah this time? Like I said, Prince Johnson party was part and parcel of the George Weah's coalition in 2017. But I think there must have been some fallout for different reasons that I was mentioning. But here's the thing: the key thing here is Joseph Boakai picked a vice presidential candidate
from
Mvemba, who is the party leader of Prince Johnson's party. So in this particular case, Joseph Boakai gave much more, I think, to that constituency than what the CDC may have been offering.
The other thing I want to say, 20 candidates, that's a lot. It's a large number for a small country. What's the population of Liberia today is about, 4 million, 5 million?
5.2 million based on the most recent population census.
Yeah, and 20 candidates. That's presidential candidates.
Yes.
I wonder how many are the candidates on the municipal and parliamentary level. Was that a problem to have 20 candidates, or was that a positive?
In a way, the fact that those candidates had possibilities to register to vote is in line, I think, with their rights. And I'm not too sure all of them were in it to win. In Liberia, the configuration is such that the winner who take it all, and I think this kind of positioning are done anticipating a potential second round, because then a negotiation on endorsement and confirming support can bring benefit to some of these smaller parties that are competing in these elections. So there's a way of trying to make sure that nobody lost per se. So when it was announced that a runoff was important, was an outcome, all the top two candidates were quoting all the candidates on the list, and that shows the importance of each of them, no matter how small their voting base was, it was important to tip the balance in either way. And I think it's good for the democratic process. I think gradually it will consolidate, but it's important that persons who have the will and possibility to contest. I think on that list, we were just concerned that there were less women who had the same possibility, and that's something that Liberia is trying to address in terms of gender equality. 2 of the candidates out of the 20 were women. Provisions in steps to reform the electoral system to ensure greater space for women participation had not progressed as much as was seen. For example, it was conceived that through a legal reform that 30%, each party will have no less than 30% of women on their party listing, but that law exists in a legal limbo, never been finalized, and parties made informal commitment through a memorandum of understanding with the NEC to uphold this, but that also was largely not respected. So we are in that situation right now.
President Boakai, the president-elect, let's call him president-elect, he's 70 years old in a country that is young, like most African countries. He lost in 2017 and gracefully conceded to President-elect Weah at the time. And I think in a way, President Weah has returned the favor by conceding this time. Can you speak a little bit of why the youth of Liberia will elect a 70-year-old when they were dealing with a candidate who was somewhat younger George Weah is how old? 59, 60?
He must be in the mid 50s, like more or less. Yeah.
So, and it was very tight. I mean, obviously, the margin of
Yes.
victory is very small. That means Weah still had a tremendous appeal in certain circles in the country. But can you dissect that a little bit? The age gap, the legacy of George Weah, and what you expect from the Boakai's presidency.
In terms of you're right. It was a very closely fought race. What separated the two is less than 2 percentage points, I would say, in the final count. That is important to note. George Weah CDC state does have appeal to significant segments of the population, and they have possibilities also of kind of learning to see what they have done and they could have done better, because definitely is did say that maybe not what they have done worked for the people. But I can say one thing, that there were a couple of efforts that under President Weah that were quick fixes efforts that resonated with certain segments of the population. And those quick fixes were, free university education or paying the WIAC fees for when students are leaving high school. They are required to pay a certain amount of fees. Some families that can be difficult. Weah immediately waived that fees when he took over. That was popular amongst. So there was a range of popular decisions reaching out to poor people in a way, and they still, it's just that they were not sustainable solutions, and when these solutions are not sustainable, then they impact on other consequences. That is an important lesson, I think. But what that means therefore is for Boakai, for the young people getting Boakai had a vice president who was a younger person, Mr. Kuhn. Senator Kuhn is a senator from Nimba County. He will leave the Senate seat once he as a vice president, and you could say that he also can maybe been a land to Boakai could have been some of the attractions for the youth. But we can see that with Liberia electing incoming President Boakai celebrated his 79th birthday yesterday. It means that Liberia is in a new territory in a way that it may be fair to say that Boakai will be a one-term president, which means he may not be seeking re-elections for a second term, looking at his age. If that kind of guess is true, it means that he may be in a situation where he can take some of the bold decisions that the previous presidents who had considerations for re-elections based on political considerations were not able to take. And that could be good news for Liberia. And what also good would mean is that very soon Liberia will see another democratic transition to another elected president. That would be good also for consolidating the democracy. Those are the ways I see this development.
What is the mood in the country today?
The mood is very hopeful. I think the WANE have inspired hope. People feel that their vote count, that the leaders can respect the people's will, and that to tell you, there has been a lot of analysis among different actors that there could have been instability based on a protracted conflict over the elections. This can have an effect on economic development and things like that, but those did not happen. And now Liberia is faced with and watching the picture of the former, the outgoing president and the incoming president working together on a joint transition team. That particular picture have inspired Liberia. It has inspired a lot of voices across the African continent as well, that where we are seeing democratic rollback just in our not too far neighborhood. We are now seeing Liberia that have had this difficulty, showing that it is able to transition to full democratic rule.
On that hopeful note, Charles Lawrence, I would like to thank you for joining us on Into Africa today and dissecting the current situation in your country, Liberia.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. We want to have more conversations about Africa. Tell your friends. Subscribe to our podcast at Apple Podcasts. You can also read our analysis and report at csis.org/Africa. So long.